Okay, step 3 in assessing our garden's soil. We're looking at fill media. This piece is going to be a bit longer, I'm sorry, but that's just what happens when we move from simply relaying facts to translating scientific understanding into actionable advice. So the question which lies before us is what to use to fill our production beds. This is almost always the first hurdle people face when they confront the reality of creating a garden, and in this doubt thrives many a company which seeks to sell its products to quickly ease your discomfort. I always try to keep things simple and cheap, so with that in mind, let's proceed. First, why are we creating garden beds? To grow crops, right? That's what you're doing, or at least that's a strong assumption I'm making. And so ultimately, all we really need to know is what nutrients the crops need, what we have on hand, and what we need to import to make up the difference. So again, we'll cover amendments later. I know it seems like it would fit so well right now, but we really can't mess with fertility until we've chosen crops that we want to grow, and we've not made it to that part of the planning process yet. All right, if you want the most basic prescription, I do suggest about 1 inch of compost per year until your soil reaches at least a medium value in the Munson soil color chart. I also say that you can't avoid the soil test. Even if you're just looking at micronutrients and doing small amendments there, a soil test does wonders for you in appropriately applying fertility and really just saving so much time and hassle. And then after establishment, you're likely going to need a slow release nitrogen. I think feather meal is probably one of the better ones. People have complained that it's a little bit expensive. That's true, but you don't need that much of it. Don't think of it like compost. It's not something you're spreading everywhere all the time. It's a slow release nitrogen. A little bit of it down the center of your bed or wherever the plants are being planted at the start of the season, and that should get you there. I mean, depending on how hard you're producing. Okay, so those are my basic suggestions. If you want to stick around for some more details, here we go. There's 2 basic directions you can go for your garden grow media. The classic way is to do it just in ground, to do what preparations you desire, then plant directly into the earth itself. Raised beds are your other option, some kind of hard border which brings the growing plane up from the surrounding ground. So you build borders, fill it up, and so we got native soil here, border edge, and bed here, raised bed. The steps are basically the same, it's just the incarnation that changes. So I suggest you look to build as cheaply as possible, then test your soil, fertilize appropriately, and that's it. Don't let it get too complicated. And a big part of this means is don't try to understand everything all at once. For now, right now, just look to understand the physical properties of the growing media you've chosen. That's it. Just try to get the physical properties of the growing media and see how it affects, how much it affects all the rest of your garden processes. And then you can start adding, what about the chemical aspects of this media, all that. Ultimately, it's very likely that even 1 inch of compost across all your production beds will be sufficient for most crops. Even if you start with a degraded soil, you're likely to quickly remediate it with routine compost additions, so don't forget to periodically test your soil, because I guarantee you that there will come a tipping point where your soil shifts from being degraded to remediated. And as soon as that happens, if you don't scale down your inputs, you're spending too much money and you're spending too much time and you're polluting the environment. Change your management style from remediation to maintenance. Save yourself the money and hassle of applying fertility that you don't need and back off your amendments once the soil tests start coming back positively. That's it. A little bit of detail about in-ground beds. I'll start with in-ground beds because I mentioned them first when I was talking, and just to let you know, I do favor them. They're often quicker and cheaper to establish and don't present nearly the number of restrictions to cultivation as a bed with a raised border. Long list of complaints short, that border is a barrier you need to cross every time you manipulate your grow space. So just think about that every time you, before you build a raised bed unnecessarily. So this border, your wheelbarrow can't get in. You have to step in if you need to get in. Your hoses have to get up and in. Well, whatever. Like, you are creating a border, and you have to deal with that. It might be worth it. It might not. My primary concerns for in-ground beds is to be sure that the site's not contaminated. Include the heavy metal option in your soil test when you send it away. Ask for a heavy metal assessment. You don't have to do this all the time, but definitely do it the first time. Conduct research about your land use history and try and find your potential legacy contaminants. That's the most important thing about an in-ground bed. You have to have clean soil to start with because you're planting straight into that soil. Usually you need to kill turf and the weeds to establish clear ground. If you've got time, then the best is just a sheet mulch. It's cheap, it's easy, it's fast. It's not fast. It's cheap and easy. You spread a sheet mulch over everything, be it cardboard or landscape fabric, whatever. Wait 2 months, 6 months or something. I mean, you can get complicated and try and do some soil solarization, but I'm not going to talk about that any more than to have said it, and maybe you want to look into it. Soil solarization. Otherwise, if you need it fast, you can spray an herbicide, you can use a deturfer, you can even try and plant into the soil while tarping all the area around your crop, so almost doing like a sheet mulch and then making holes that you plant something into, but know that weeds are going to grow up and through that, and so you're just going to have to pay attention at those spots, but it gets you growing faster, so it's kind of a trade-off. All right, last thing, amend what you need to get to the right texture, the right pH, the right fertility. That's it. Amend what you need. Don't just start amending. Okay, raised beds. There are most assuredly circumstances where raised beds are necessary. The primary one is the first thing that I'm looking at when I want to do an in-ground bed. Is the soil contaminated? Is there something that I don't want to grow my plants in? If so, if that's dirty soil, then I do want to make a raised bed. In fact, I want to put down a barrier to keep my plant roots from going into that dirty soil. The other thing could be, especially when we're talking urban environments, raised beds are great because you can import and hold soil where there is no soil otherwise. I visited a garden where each bed was on wheels, on casters, and it simply existed atop a previously paved yard, like someone had basically extended their driveway through their backyard or something. It was crazy. It was there before the lady had moved in. She moved in, it would cost too much to rip out all the concrete and whatever, so she just put a bunch of smallish but raised beds on wheels, and she had a pretty bumping garden. It was going pretty well. I've also been to rooftops. Those obviously don't hold much more than accumulated dust unless you build something to actually hold growing media. So my primary concerns for raised beds: be sure your fill media is not contaminated. So just because you're getting it from a bag doesn't mean it's clean. Despite all the room on those 25-pound, 3 cubic foot bags, they're not required to disclose any analysis of their media. In fact, they don't need to test for anything that they don't claim on the label. So if they want to say NPK is 10-10-10, then they need to test and ensure that. But so long as they don't say it's lead-free, then they don't need to test for lead. And what's more, if they do conduct this analysis, they're only required to put a little note on the bag which redirects you to their website, which hosts the analysis of whatever they conducted. Crazy. The short being, don't trust bagged media to be clean. All right, step 2, create your borders with a cheap material and then decide if you want to line the base or not. For me, I preference growing in ground, but if I were to create a raised bed and my in-ground soil were not contaminated, I would leave the base open because I like the roots to be able to connect to that reservoir of that greater soil body. You may have your own reason, again, like maybe there is no soil below, maybe that soil is contaminated, and you put some kind of base on your bed to keep the roots from spreading. And then lastly, just like with in-ground, amend until you get the right texture, the right pH, and the right fertility. That's it. Just because it's out of a bag doesn't mean it's ready to go. So test your bagged media, see what you need to do. All right, media. I keep saying this word. What does it mean? Media is the most neutral term to describe what a plant roots into and grows from. We could also say substrate, but I try to avoid that one as it, to me and seemingly, I think, to some others, it starts to imply certain things about the material in question. So media, because almost everything that you import to your site for fertility or raising a bed will not actually be soil, so it's media. Whether we take the physical definition, particles less than 2 millimeters in diameter, or the ecological definition, a living body in situ, neither are coming out of a bag, neither are soil. And so at best you get sand, lots of sand, because it's cheap and it adds weight to make the bag feel not cheap. Otherwise, you get enormous amounts of filler agent as bits of bark. They'll call it like recycled forest products, but it's just a bunch of bark from their lumber operations. It's organic matter, but it's basically no nutrition. It just takes up space, provides very, very little to fertility to your plants. It's just bulk, airspace. So again, I say try and keep it cheap. They're trying to keep it cheap in those bags. I say try and keep it cheap and focus on your fertility. You basically don't need most of what they're giving you. Pay for the actual fertility that you need, and that's it. A single application of compost is probably going to be enough. You don't want to spend too much. You don't want to over apply. You can burn your plants. You can leach and pollute the local environment. You'll end up with a deflated, half-filled bed next year because it was just so hot or so porous that it just condensed. You'll be stuck in this vicious cycle of over-applying extensive, unnecessary compounds to keep filling up this diminishing bed. But if you want my opinion, and as long as we're clear that this is my opinion, then this is what I would do. Optimally, find clean local fill dirt for your raised bed. You might be able to dig up from your own site. You might need to be on the lookout for areas near you. The next best option would be bulk logs or other fallen wood. I'm not arguing for hugelkultur. I'm not even going into that discussion right now. I'm just pointing out that fallen wood can be really cheap or free. It takes up a lot of space. It will decompose. And in the meantime, it's quite inert and it's both incredibly carbon rich and has a low surface area to volume ratio. My third option would be to keep looking for as large pieces of carbon as I can. I don't want to fill it with sheets of cardboard, but maybe even wood chips. That wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. After these options are exhausted, and I've still not found anything, I've got two choices. I could continue to wait and hunt websites and local areas to find acceptable surplus media, or I could decrease the depth of my raised bed. Far and away, your biggest concern should be how quickly this bed might dry out. If it's connected to the native soil underneath, then no big deal, and honestly, I'm right back to saying why bother with the raised bed at all. If it is isolated and disconnected from that surface, then you really need to start considering a lot more options than we can discuss here. I guess some very basic guidance would be to not go more shallow than 4 inches, but that's pushing it. I would say a pretty strong preference towards more about 10 inches. So review your options. Make your choice, get your cheapest media to fill your bed as possible, and then if you've got some kind of soil as compared to, say, logs or wood chips, then just like an in-ground bed, get a soil test of what fertility you need. Then compare that to what analyses you can find from local compost providers and your bagged media options, and just start amending your fertility in after you've made the bulk addition of the cheap or free ingredients. All right, best of luck. Let me know if you got any questions.